Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly through the lattice gate of a forgotten world. The lamps have just been lit along the garden walls, and you can smell the faint bitterness of crushed time beneath your sandals. Not because of poisonous plants or garden gnomes with knives, but because Ottoman court gardening was a high-stakes political game disguised as horticulture. Every leaf could be a statement, every path a metaphor, and those gardeners, the scent tickles your nose like a gentle tease, reminding you that in Ottoman gardens, the hierarchy of smell was as deliberate as anything carved into stone. That's a Bostek, one of the elite imperial gardeners, trimming the rose bushes with the care of a jeweler handling sapphires. They were trained in philosophy, astronomy, and this court gossip. You don tea, tend a tulip, unless you know whether the Grand Vizier prefers crimson or white this season. Their fins ripple the water like sentences forming in reverse. This pond, it's shaped like a tugra, the royal calligraphic signature of the Sultan. From above, it spells out his name in a flourish of aquatic plants and marbled stone. No wonder pigeons carried political messages here. The whole garden was already a letter, signed in petals. And you definitely dan tea prune near the Queen Mother's window. If she's been in a bad mood since breakfast. His eyes flit to a nearby quince tree, and he subtly adjusts one of its limbs. It now curves west toward the kitchens. Why? Maybe the cooks requested a message. Maybe a rival gardener planted a warning. Or maybe that branch now points to the fact that the empire's best gossip, freshly ripe and slightly sour, grows under its own coded sun. He's not just beautifying a hedge, he's maintaining the emotional barometer of the court. It's a whispering library. Every petal is a letter. Every breeze, a courier. You step lightly, because this is the meditation garden, where silence was once so strictly enforced that sneezers were politely escorted out. Everything here is shaped in twos, twin streams, twin bushes, twin shadows. A visual poem to duality, body and soul, sultan and people, life and decay. Ottoman poets wrote verses based on garden layout. Gardeners replied by rearranging shrubs. See, roses bloom when the empire is at peace. If one wilts, it could be a bad omen. If many wilt, well, historians still argue whether the mass pruning of roses in 1702 was an aesthetic choice or an early warning system. The outer courts smelled clean and faintly citrusy bitter orange blossoms for humility. The deeper you went, the richer the scents. Roses for power, muskroot for mystery, and in the innermost sanctum, henna trees that gave the air a spice like the breath of an ancient queen. They were part monk, part spy, part floricultural wizard. It's the end of a long summer's day in 17th century Istanbul. And I'd love to know where you re-listening from. Drop your location and local time in the comments, especially if your cat is currently ignoring you, and you're wandering into the imperial gardens of Topkapi Palace, where nothing, absolutely nothing, is planted by accident. Tulips glow in hushed clusters, peacocks gossip low in the shadows, and if you listen carefully, you might hear the gentle rustle of secrets drifting between hedges. These aren't just gardens, they're coded landscapes, living letters, softly pruned hieroglyphs of court intrigue. And here's the twist. You probably wouldn't survive this job. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pass under an arch of blooming jasmines. It's quiet here, but not silent. You hear a soft snick-snack metal on branch. These gardeners weren't your average green-thumbed grandpas in floppy hats. The path curves now through a field of pale blue irises. You kneel beside a basin where koi flicker beneath moonlight. A garden bueno, older than 12 shuffles past, dragging a tiny rake. As you rest on a velvet-cushioned bench carved into the trunk of a plane tree, you realize this isn't a garden. You lean your back against the wide trunk of a sycamore, its bark mottled like old parchment, and gaze upward into the leafy canopy overhead. Somewhere beyond those branches, the Sultan once stood in full regalia, the hem of his robe brushing the fine gravel path. As his eyes scanned the garden like a general surveying his troops, not a flower bloomed without his consent, not a hedge curled without purpose. This was more than his sanctuary, it was his green cloak, the imperial garment made not of silk or gold, but of scent, shade, and symbolic symmetry. Nothing fancy, but you'd be wise not to touch it. That's a galgelic, a sacred spot planted where a past sultan once liked to nap. No one dared answer, of course, but that night a row of lilies appeared along his favorite path, their pale heads bowed like courtiers, too shy to speak. Historians still argue whether that was the work of the chief gardener or the palace astrologer. The mound remains untouched in his memory. Lavender for tranquility, the mound for respect. But the nearby sign reads, "Here stood the jasmine of Mahidevran, Mahidevran's sultan, a consort of Suleiman, the Magnificent, loved this corner so fiercely she once threatened to uproot the gardener who dared replant it. Her jasmine died in a frost, and rather than replace it, the spot remains empty, a political silence left unspoken, its grief encoded in topsoil. And tonight, you're learning to speak it." The canopy above is heavy with dark clusters, their skins matte in the moonlight. Each bunch is tied gently with a red silk thread, a tradition. Red for protection against envy. Silk because nothing else was considered gentle enough for royal grapes. You pop one into your mouth. It's not sweet. It's earthy, almost bitter. But you nod respectfully anyway. You're eating the empire's memory. Of course, some say that one overly ambitious vizier once tried to plant tulips over such a mound to impress the current ruler. The Ottomans believed that certain tones could ward off corruption, not just spiritual, but administrative. A sharp chime for ambition, a low bell for humility, the Sultan's personal path, tuned in minor chords to encourage deep reflection, or perhaps indigestion. The jury's still out. The story ends with him reassigned to Albania permanently. You rise slowly, brushing a stray petal from your sleeve, and begin walking again, this time along a narrow path of alternating black and white stones. The Sultan's green cloak doesn't flow at roots, it anchors, and as you run your fingers along a vine-draped wall, you realize something odd. The vines twist clockwise on this side of the garden, counterclockwise on the other. Deliberate? Oh, absolutely. It's a nod to the spiral of the universe. Or maybe just a subtle reminder that no matter how lush the garden, the empire always rotates around one man. This pattern isn't decorative, it's deliberate. It's an allusion to the Sultan's role as Zilula Fillard, the shadow of God on earth. The dual tones are a visual nod to cosmic balance, day and night, mercy and justice. If you ever wondered what divine right looked like in horticultural form, it's this stripe of stones under your sleepy feet. The Ottomans didn't invent paradise gardens, but oh, did they refine them. Influenced by Persian traditions and Islamic notions of paradise Jannah, they designed their palace grounds to embody divine order. You see it everywhere. Water channels split into four like the rivers of Eden, pomegranate trees lining the walls in symbolic fertility, and fig trees whose trunks twist just enough to hint at life's gentle unpredictability. In the center of one courtyard sits a small, unassuming mound of earth, ringed by low-growing lavender. Beneath the shade of a tall cypress tree, you come across a gardener kneeling on a patterned cushion. His hands are muddy, but he moves like a calligrapher, composing a poem. He's not planting vegetables or flowers. He's placing tiny aromatic herbs in the shape of an imperial monogram, visible only when they bloom in spring. Each year, the design changes subtly, a cipher only the inner court can read. It's said that one Sultan Ahmed III perhaps once walked through the gardens and asked a single question: "What season is this?" Without the lily's echo. There's a sudden hush as you cross under a grapevine trellis. From behind the hedge, the soft ring of copper chimes drifts on the breeze. They're not for decoration either. And then, unexpectedly, you pass a patch of earth left bare, just gravel and wind. It looks forgotten. Your path loops back toward the fountain, and you pause there, watching the ripples again. You breathe in deep sandalwood, crushed leaves, a whiff of roasting almonds from the kitchen's end. Close your eyes. The garden isn't just a place, it's a language. A breeze nudges your shoulder as you turn onto a narrower, less ornate path, its edges lined not with roses or lavender, but with tulips. Not just any tulips, though. These are the Sultan's tulips. And if you're thinking of cheery little bulbs bobbing in a Dutch postcard, think again. These blooms are taller, thinner, with petals that taper to a fine point, like calligraphy strokes curling into ink. In the Ottoman Empire, the tulip wasn't a flower, it was a philosophy, and more than that, a code. You stoop slightly, brushing a finger gently along a deep crimson tulip. The blue tulips, you'll notice, are positioned in a ring just inside the yellows. Blue, the color of melancholy and truth. Others, a gentle curl. Those aren't natural accidents. That's tulip punctuation. Gardeners pinched or folded petals in minuscule ways to add nuance. It weaves between the tulips like it owns the playsand. Maybe it does. Ottoman palace cats were famously untouchable. Some even had their own garden patches, planted with valerian and catmint. If the cat stops in a tulip bed, that's no accident. It might be selecting the color palette for next week's message. Or maybe it just likes sunbeams. In this garden, you never really know. Velvet and weightless, like a thought too shy to speak. That's the thing about tulips in this garden. They weren't just grown, they were composed. And every morning, before the palace awoke, the gardeners walked these beds like editors scanning a page. A slightly upturned tip might soften a message. A clipped edge that's practically shouting, waiting for someone patient enough to listen to tulips whisper. Yellow of change. The inner circle, made up entirely of black tulips' rare brooding things, signifies decisions made in secrecy, practicing, training. The clipboard itself is old cedar, with soft grooves etched into its frame where tulip stems have worn it smooth over decades. He doesn't speak. He doesn't have to. His tulip grammar is flawless. Anyone who understood the pattern would read the message clearly. Regret shadows the Sultan's next move. He pauses, nods at the tulips, and changes, tune one note higher. he's not improvising. That note shift corresponds to the bloom gradient behind you. Music, like flowers, was another language in this garden of symbols. But if you were just visiting from Venice, you'd probably say, "My, what lovely flowers." These mimic tulip arrangements that once grew in this very corner. The living flowers are gone, but their meaning is preserved forever in glazed ceramic. The tiles are mirrored deliberately off-center by a half-petal, a rebel tulip, and just next to it, a stone placed oddly, halfway buried. That's not laziness, that's emphasis. A tulip leaning in defiance, marked with a mute stone, might mean anything from the air is favored to the soup last night was treasonously salty. The truth is, only a few high officials could read this floral shorthand fluently, and even fewer could respond. It's a reminder that messages fade, but their shadows linger. Velvet soft, its color indicates serenity, so says the tradition, but it's leaning slightly too close to a white one. That gardener, the story goes, was promoted unexpectedly, which might suggest either forgiveness or fear. And in this particular bed, that combination means something entirely different: diplomatic tension. See, these tulip beds weren't just decorative displays. They were a floral newsletter for the inner court. If the red grew near the white, it was understood the vizier and the admiral were not on speaking terms. Move one of those flowers. Well, you might accidentally suggest a reconciliation, or worse, a plot. Historians still argue whether a rogue gardener once rearranged a bed of tulips in 1730 to make it look like an insult to the Janissaries. As you walk farther in, the tulips grow denser. You reach a circular formation, perfect symmetry, 12 colors radiating outward like a sunburst. This wasn't for aesthetics. This was a message crafted for a single man, the Sultan himself. His astrologer had declared that Mercury was in retrograde and advised against all written communication. So, naturally, the court responded by planting an argument in tulips. You sit at the edge of the circle, half lulled by the shifting tones of color. And then there are the tulip petals themselves. Look closely, some have tiny notches at the tips. You pass a gardener hunched over a clipboard, but it's not paper. He's pressing petals into wet clay. Suddenly, a cat saunters across the path, white with one gray ear. You pause near a wall covered in intricate floral tiles. A court musician strolls by, playing a ney flute so soft it sounds like the garden breathing. And then, under a trellis dusted in moonlight, you notice one tulip growing sideways, bold, off the beaten angle. It doesn't follow the other's rhythm. You pluck a fallen petal, turn it in your fingers. Beneath the quiet, you realize this language wasn't dead. It just went dormant. The path takes a gentle turn, winding away from the tulip beds and into a shaded corridor of laurel and boxwood. You're entering the domain of the wine-readers, the garden philosophers whose role was to interpret motion, scent, and light like a diplomat reads facial expressions. Known among the Bostank as Rusgard Deli, the language of the wind was partly superstition, partly observation, and entirely political. But the real stars were the willows, flexible, expressive, and just moody enough to suggest subtext. A willow that drooped suddenly in summer, possibly an omen, or possibly just thirsty. But if 3 willows sagged in unison, you sent word to the palace astrologer immediately. Wind was believed to carry not only seeds and scents, but news. This wasn't an herb garden for cooking, it was a wind maze. Gardeners would release feathers from the center and note which plants quivered as they drifted. the results, transcribed onto scrolls and sealed with wax. You peek over simple marks in columns denoting wind speed, direction, and leaf flutter. It's cooler now, sweetened with the smell of damp stone and thyme. Somewhere, a tree shifts with a sound like distant applause. You're not sure what it means, but here in the garden of wind readers, even your confusion is welcome. It's all part of the message, nothing dramatic. Until you notice the pattern matches a poem you saw etched into a rose arbor earlier today. That's the real twist. Many of the court poems were based on wind readings. Poetry wasn't just art, it was data. It's tuned. You learn not to notes, but to messages. If it plays a descending scale, the Grand Vizier is content. If it trills upward, the Sultan is displeased. If it goes eerily silent, well, that happened once, and no one speaks of it now. If the rosemary vibrated before the mint, the divan would meet early. One rolls to your foot, and you pick it up. It's been marked with saffron dust, a sign that it was placed here, not fallen. Saffron was used to tag listen to trees, ones deemed sensitive to the smallest shifts, a kind of living court stenographer, except greener and less gossipy, mostly if the opposite occurred. Someone important was likely to oversleep, even moods. He insisted the wind changed pitch before a storm. Others rolled their eyes. Still, they moved his quarters closer to the Admiralty. If the breeze came from the north and carried the scent of cardamom, something had shifted in the palace kitchens. If it came from the east and stirred only the apricot trees, someone in the harem was plotting a move. Here, the foliage wasn't just decorative, it was diagnostic. You hear the rustling before you feel the breeze branches whispering above you. You spot the first sign. A copper tag dangles from a branch, swinging slightly. It's shaped like a crescent moon. Not unusual unless you count the precise length of the chain 5 links. That number, in this context, indicates unrest brewing on the western border. No messenger would dare speak it aloud. But if you walked through this section on a windy morning and noticed all crescent tags leaning westward, well, you'd understand. Leaves trembling in anticipation. It's subtle, almost imperceptible. But for the Ottoman court gardeners, this was no ordinary wind. This was information. You pass under a wooden pergola draped in honeysuckle and realize you're being watched not by people, but by the trees themselves. Bending low under a fig tree, this system, the best wind readers could tell you the court's temperature, political, not meteorological. They'd close their eyes, feel the dust, taste the air, and pronounce something cryptic like, "The peach bough is restless today," and that, somehow, meant the treasurer was embezzling grain. Historians still argue whether Sultan Murad IV actually relied on these readings before passing new laws. But considering how he once banned tobacco after watching a cherry tree shed too early, well, you decide. The trees themselves were chosen for their interpretive qualities. Cypress for vigilance, olive for longevity, plane trees for emotional stability. You find yourself in a corner of the garden with a curious layout, narrow, winding rows of rosemary and mint, shaped like spiraling gusts. One gardener long retired. His name lost to time was rumored to predict naval disasters 3 days in advance, simply by watching a patch of ornamental grasses near the baths. You reach a modest pavilion shaded by vines, where a wind harp hums ever so faintly in the evening air. You sit cross-legged beside a juniper bush that's shedding berries like secrets. A nearby gardener scratches notes into a wax tablet. You close your eyes and feel the breeze drift across your cheeks. The wind dies down as you round the corner, and now your feet crunch softly on tiny, symmetrical pebbles, gray, white, pale rose, repeating like a coded lullaby underfoot. The path here is wider, flanked by low hedges and precisely spaced lanterns, each casting a muted golden glow. It's soothing, peaceful, but you start to notice something odd. No two sections of the walkway are quite the same. One curves a little more than it should. Another narrows unexpectedly. Still another dips ever so slightly toward a rose bush. These aren't design quirks. They're signals. Its fruit dangles just low enough to brush the shoulder of anyone walking too proudly. Each point once represented one of the empire's key alliances: the Safavid border, the Venetian trade routes, and the internal Janissary factions. Courtiers might meet here for hushed conversations beneath the fig canopy, pretending to admire the grapes while discussing policy. One wrong grape leaf plucked from the wrong side of the trellis, and someone might get the message they weren't invited next time. Some say it was planted to humble high-ranking officials. Others believe it was just exceptionally shady that year. This was the nexus point, what the gardeners called the eye of the maze. And with the fall of night, a new rule begins. No one walks the central path unless invited. It's not written anywhere, but you feel it in the air, in the weight of the silence. A gentle hush has fallen over the paths, as if the stones themselves are waiting for tomorrow's messages to begin forming. Courtiers would gather here in what appeared to be informal strolls. In reality, this was a political arena where power shifted with foot placement and eyebrow tilts, and the gardeners watched it all. They knew who lingered in which quadrant, who turned their back to whom, and who stared too long at the citrus grove. Historians still debate whether the Grand Admiral tripped on it in 1667 or was subtly tripped by it. Welcome to the power paths, because in this garden, even the wind knows its place. These weren't just botanical decorations. They marked which department of court life that stretch of path symbolized. Walk beneath the carnation. You're in the zone of public affairs. Under the cypress, matters of death, inheritance, and history. The poppy, that's the dream corridor. A place where poets walked and laws were sometimes rewritten in verse. Every stone here was laid with deliberation, mapped like a diagram of court hierarchy and imperial geography. The other is raw gravel that crunches loudly with each step brash, hard, unmistakable. He isn't cleaning, though not really. He's realigning the pebbles, resetting the signals. Think of him as a line editor for the imperial footnotes. His strokes are soft but precise. Leftward slant, message accepted. Rightward slant, message deflected. The pebbles crunch under his broom like whispered adjustments to the story. This wasn't a matter of budget. It was a built-in metaphor, tact, or boldness. Gardeners noted who chose which, and the Sultan. He could walk both. That was the privilege of power. You might think it's just a garden stroll, but take the wrong path and you've just committed a silent offense, laid out in gravel and trimmed hedge. Every bend reflected rank. Every fork echoed a choice. You think your office layout is political. Here, the shade of a fig tree could define a decade-long alliance. Walk straight across the patterned pebbles without pausing at the water basin. That suggests arrogance. Turn left where you should have looped around the olive tree. A quiet insult to the minister of ceremonies. And if you cross into the pebble circle without being summoned, well, let's just say you'll be pulling weeds in Anatolia for the next 10 years. The paths in these imperial gardens weren't just routes, they were a social chessboard. There's a section ahead where the path forms a perfect crescent open end, pointing toward the palace. This is known as the listening loop. Gardeners would observe where the courtiers paused here. If you stopped right in the curve's heart, facing outward, you were signaling attentiveness to foreign affairs. If you stood on the edge with your back to the palace, that was a subtle cue you felt neglected. Of course, the gardeners never commented. They just noted your position in their little ledgers, written in horticultural shorthand and lemon juice. At the curve's edge, a lone pomegranate tree leans slightly over the path. You continue onward, passing through a triangular arrangement of cedar posts and vine trellises. This shape isn't arbitrary, it's a political diagram. You pause at a curious fork in the path. One side is paved with smooth river stones, comforting, elegant, diplomatic. A gardener glides past, pushing a broom made of bundled reeds. You take the quieter route, passing under a pergola carved with tulip motifs. Each arch bears a different floral relief: rose, carnation, cypress, poppy. Further along, the paths converge into a wide circle surrounding a low fountain. It's getting darker now. The lanterns have warmed into little amber stars along the pebbled edges. You step aside, letting a breeze pass first. The sound of water draws you in, now soft, uneven, just barely a trickle over stone. You're entering the fountain quarter, and you quickly notice these fountains Dante behave quite like others you've seen. The flow doesn't arc or burst. It sighs, it loops, it dribbles and swirls. Ottoman gardeners didn't just design fountains to soothe, they made them speak. You stand beside the first basin, a shallow dish carved from marble so pale it catches starlight like milk. A delicate spout in the shape of a tulip stem pours a slow, spiraling stream knot down the center. But along the side, where it trickles into a ring of small channels shaped like flower petals. This is the Concord Basin, and its meaning is poetic. Unity desired, but not yet achieved. It was placed near the court meeting rooms, where officials gathered to debate. Gardeners adjusted water height during arguments. If the streams neared each other, tensions eased. If they diverged, well, you might want to reschedule that tax reform proposal. This design wasn't aesthetic fluff, it was a code. Each petal stood for a month of the year. The water runs over their backs in silence, then spills into small bowls made from sea-polished glass. This fountain was tuned for night, they say. Its shape catches the cool air, guiding it downward. These fountains didn't soothe the empire, they narrated it. At certain hours, it whistles ever so slightly like a lullaby. This was no accident. In a palace where gossip could kill, sleep was guarded. The fountains helped. The basin is cracked, patched several times. He tells you, without looking up, that this was the truth. Well, these weren't water features. They were mood regulators, status markers, whispering advisors. And like so much in this garden, they existed in layers. Surface beauty for the eye, coded signals for the trained, and beneath that, something quieter still, something for the soul. At its center stands a column topped by a rotating copper disc. The water strikes the disc and turns it slowly. This motion doesn't serve a practical function, it's ceremonial. Every quarter turn aligns with one of the empire's cardinal cities: Edorn, Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo. When the disk turned toward Cairo, sweet spices were scattered across the water, honoring the city's contributions to palace medicine and perfume. This, too, was a message. One a visiting ambassador would notice. One the gardeners recorded. It only flowed when 3 gardeners agreed on a reading, which, of course, almost never happened. A dry basin was a symbol of doubt, and in Ottoman politics, doubt was often the beginning of trouble. The water is still, black, absorbing moonlight like ink. Speak here, and your voice returns, not in words, but in ripples. Gardeners claimed this pool could reveal intentions. If the ripples returned straight truth, if they bent or scattered deceit. One Grand Vizier reportedly confessed a secret here after watching his reflection blur and warp. Could be garden myth, could be anxiety, could be jacaranda, pollen, hard to say. The gardener adjusted the flow daily so the stream would land in the appropriate month. If the water deviated, the meaning changed, perhaps a warning or a subtle approval. And if it skipped petals altogether, well, that was practically shouting. As you move to the next fountain, you notice it's much quieter, intentionally so. The water doesn't fall, it seeps, cascading over fine grooves etched into a stone slab. The water's pace, temperature, scent, and even mineral content were monitored. A sudden shift in fragrance, say, if the water started to carry hints of clove or lemon mint, new imports had arrived in the port. If it turned metallic, someone, somewhere, had overstepped. This was called facilitasu, whispering water. Court poets would sit nearby, scribbling verses influenced by the rhythm of the trickle. One famously claimed that he received divine inspiration when the water briefly changed pitch at dawn. Was it spiritual coincidence? A particularly dramatic pigeon? Historians still argue. The fountains, like everything in this garden, were calibrated, not just for beauty, but for information. You stop at a basin where the water falls in a staccato pattern, clink, clink, clink. There's a rhythm to it, almost like a heartbeat. The pattern changes with the hour, adjusted manually by a gardener using small ceramic plugs to redirect flow. In this way, the fountain kept time not just for sleep or prayer, but for politics. One pulse pattern might mean the Sultan was in consultation. Another meant the kitchen had been closed for private meals. The most ominous, no sound at all. A fountain silenced was a sign that someone had disappeared. Beneath the covered walkway, you find a fountain designed with 4 spouts that never touch. Each stream curves inward but stops short of convergence. One older gardener, his beard long and trailing, like ivy, sits near the edge of a dry fountain, humming. You move past and arrive at a circular pool bordered with smooth obsidian tiles. And then there's the echo pool. You find it at the far end, tucked beneath a canopy of jacaranda trees. You crouch beside a small tiered fountain with stone fish for spouts. You trail a finger through the stream of one basin, feeling its gentle insistence, like a thought that never quite forms. You lean back, letting the sound of trickling water lull your breath into rhythm. It's uneven, deliberate, strangely comforting. The sound of water fades as you step away from the fountains and enter a quieter part of the garden and orchard, by the look of it. Plum trees, tall and sculpted, stand in neat rows with trunks smooth as candle wax and branches twisted like dancers mid-pirouette. These trees were witnesses, confidancing, sometimes conspirators. The air here is thick, with the scent of ripening fruit sweet tart, and faintly perfumed with a hint of rosewater. But the arrangement feels careful, not merely planted for taste or yield. This orchard has geometry, intention, emotion. In poetry, a golden plum could symbolize a lover waiting by a lattice window, a sultan's wish for an heir, or the memory of a childhood spent in distant provinces. A crooked branch could suggest an unspoken affection, a missing tree, mourning, a sudden replacement, political remarriage. These are the Ickies, Eric, the twin plums. Legend has it that they were planted by a gardener in love with someone beyond his station. But oral tradition holds that the garden paths changed that spring, subtly rerouted to avoid walking past the weeping fig. In Ottoman symbolism, this too had meaning. The unripe fruit was used in metaphor for impatience, for a love pursued too soon. Court poets warned against plucking the green, a phrase which also quietly advised against rushing courtship. The orchard was romantic advice disguised as agriculture. It's not a design error. This is the Yankee Akaki, the echo tree. Gardeners whispered questions into its hollow during pruning. Each branch a sentence shaped by longing, duty, joy, or regret. The gardeners understood that love was dangerous in the court, but in the orchard it could breathe. If the branch grew toward them the following spring, it meant yes. You follow them quietly, wondering how many confessions have passed through plum and shadow. If it bent away, no. They say it once helped decide whether a marriage proposal should be forwarded to the harem matron. You don't ask how it turned out. Too lowly for a lady of the court, too proud to stay silent, he shaped his feelings into flora. The trees grew side by side, never touching but always leaning inward. Here the trees are older, their limbs thicker, gnarled. This is where symbolic trees were allowed to age undisturbed. You come across one with copper nails driven into its trunk in a spiraling pattern, a strange sight until you recall the tradition. Each nail represents a year of separation. It's believed a princess once marked each year away from her homeland here, and gardeners kept the practice alive long after she left. They say the tree never bloomed again. Sentimental fiction, perhaps, but the nails are real. The ribbon, a later addition, perhaps added by someone who knew, or someone who simply guessed. But gardeners used them, too. The placement of the trees lightly off the main axis suggests this one tells a story about exile. Maybe a favorite concubine sent away. Tucked into the corner is a solitary almond triots, trunk bleached and twisted, flowers long gone. This tree is never pruned. It's considered sacred. Legend says it marks the site where a gardener was buried, one whose final act was carving a lover's initials into the bark. No one's sure if the story is true, but the initials remain. Or a favored advisor fallen from grace. The shadow it casts touches none of the other trunks, isolated, intentional. You take a slow walk down the central path, noticing how some trees lean toward each other, while others grow pointedly apart. That's not the work of randomness. In Ottoman garden culture, orchard design was narrative. Plums were not just fruit, they were metaphors. Their bloom, brief and delicate, stood for courtly love and fleeting power. Their harvest marked anniversaries of treaties, weddings, even royal betrayals. If a tree was removed, it was usually not because of disease. It had simply outlived its meaning. You pause under a tree heavy with golden plums. These were once considered the fruit of longing. There's a pair of trees up ahead, Their trunks are bound loosely with a faded silk ribbon. No one cuts it. It's been there for decades. The Ottoman court discouraged romantic expression in public. But here, in the garden's green hush, it bloomed quietly under bark and blossom. Historians still debate whether an entire orchard was once replanted in the wake of a particularly messy dynastic scandal. Records are murky. Your fingers brush against a cluster of underripe plum, small, firm, not ready. You continue toward the back of the grove, where the shadows deepen and the air cools. Further along, you spot a tree growing in a crooked circle, almost like it tried to loop back on itself. You reach the orchard's edge, where vines trail over a low stone wall. As you stand beneath the bowing branches, the garden feels less like a map and more like a diary. Each tree, a page. A breeze stirs the upper branches, scattering a few dry leaves onto the path ahead. Here, love didn't bloom loudly. It was pruned, whispered, and preserved in bark, in fruit, in the slow turn of time. The orchard path dissolves into a rougher edge now. Stones give way to packed dirt, where weeds poke through with cheerful defiance. At first glance, this area might seem neglected, a little unruly. Gardeners haven't trimmed every corner, and not every plant here appears in neat rows. But in Ottoman garden design, the borders, those spaces between the cultivated and the wild, were deeply meaningful. It's here, among the nettles and dock leaves, the creeping clover and the sly morning glory, that you begin to sense a different kind of message. One that doesn't shout with roses or whisper in tulips, but instead mumbles truths in thistles. But don't let the chaos fool you. This is the most intentional wilderness in the entire garden. These cheerful rebels were tolerated here for a reason. They represented the people. This is Syrian palace mint, grown near areas where security was lax or voices tended to rise. The scent of mint, fresh and pungent, helped mask sensitive conversations. It was a form of aromatic camouflage. If you smell mint near the stables, someone's whispering something they shouldn't. Thistle was considered the plant of caution. Too many thistles in one spot. That meant don't approach. Ivy was the plant of memory. Once it took root, it was rarely removed. The rules not included in court protocol. This was the language of the unofficial, just existing. As if to say, we're here, even when you forget, especially when you forget. And in an empire ruled by performance and ritual, the unofficial could be the most honest voice of all. It was believed that ivy kept watch over forgotten parts of the palace and official histories. Gardeners sometimes used it to mark corners where things had been covered up, or to honor someone who had quietly disappeared. Some thistles were even dyed petals brushed with saffron or pomegranate ink to send specific warnings. Saffron thistle meant awaiting judgment. Pomegranate thistle meant already judged. You never wanted to see the latter near your office window. Dandelions grow everywhere, even where they aren't wanted. They pop up in poetry, in jokes, in poorly planned kitchen gardens. Gardeners often let them linger on the margins as a quiet reminder that power, no matter how pruned, never fully controls the ground beneath it. You've entered the margin zone, the place of purposeful weeds. Too much of it, too close to the inner garden, and it meant trouble. This is the Yelnus icrelti, the solitary fern. Gardeners believed it only grew in places where secrets were kept. One tale claims that a palace guard confessed his love here every evening for 3 years, only to find one morning the fern had vanished. he was transferred that same week. Garden myth. Possibly, but in a garden like this, myth and memory grow on the same roots. Gardeners believed nettle indicated resistance both in the body and the bureaucracy. Here, brambles wrap around old stone and mushrooms cluster near the shade. These are the Gagic Bitcaleri, the transitional plants. They mark where the imperial garden ends and the forgotten spaces begin. A sort of no man's land between order and entropy. This is where gardeners tested new species, hid experimental grafts, or buried cuttings from trees associated with scandal. And since it was also used to brew a healing tea, its presence was layered, pain and remedy in one leaf. If you knew how to read it, you'd know whether the court was bracing for change or licking its wounds. To most visitors, this section might look like an oversight, a patch left untouched due to laziness or low priority. Bending down, you pluck a sprig of purslane. It's lemony, fresh, and growing in clusters by the wall. In palace kitchens, purslane was a cooling herbs served during hot tempers and hotter summers. But here, in the outer garden's edge, its presence hinted at tension. Gardeners used it as a cooling signal, planted subtly after political meetings grew heated. You'd never say outright that the vizier was upset. You'd just sow some purslane and wait. Further along, a patch of stinging nettle rustles quietly in the wind. Historians still argue whether nettle appeared mysteriously near the Sultan's bathhouse in the spring of 1682. The records are vague, but shortly after, 2 prominent advisors were reassigned to outposts for reflection. Coincidence? The gardeners just smiled. You pause by a cluster of dandelions, their bright heads nodding sleepily in the dusk. Past the dandelions, you spot a stand of wild mint bushy and untamed. It's not meant for cooking. Near the edge of a mossy rock, a small fern curls tightly. You duck beneath a tangled arch of honeysuckle and reach the truly wild corner. A lonely thistle stands tall in the middle of a clearing. You crouch beside a sprawl of creeping ivy, its vines moving slowly along the wall like fingers tracing old lines. The weeds here aren't rebellious, they're reminders, the stories not written down. The weeds wave slightly in the breeze, not beckoning, not warning. You rise, brushing soil from your palms, and take one last look at the margin zone. There's a shift as you rejoin the main garden. The neat hedges return, the gravel paths resume their rhythmic crunch beneath your sandals, and the lighting softens again. Lanterns, shaped like half-moons, glowing with an amber hush. But there's tension here, woven into the neatness, a careful tightness. Every clipped shrub, every sculpted pinacone stood like a paragraph in a report. The shapes weren't chosen for whimsy, they were assessments. Others say the wind was blamed for political convenience. The truth, as always in this garden, is somewhere between the shears. There are several of these hierarchs, modeled after a different rank: judge, admiral, janissary, captain. The folds and swirls aren't just decorative, they're messages. Lopsided grapes, unbalanced pears, a pomegranate oddly tilted. This isn't a mistake, it's satire. The fruit folly, they called it, maintained by the gardener philosophers as a reminder that power unchecked spoils. During certain ceremonies, officials were made to walk past this display. If they laughed, safe. If they scowled, watched. If they didn't notice at all, promoted. This is the rehabilitation zone. If a gardener or courtier fell too far, they might be assigned here to tend nothing. A spiral boxwood path that ends in a tiny floral heart. Quiet reminders that even judgment must bend toward mercy. After all, this is a garden, not a courtroom. The pine was considered neutral, unjudging. To prune, it was a ritual of humility, to sit beside it in silence, a vow of patience. They were about attention, reflection, a slow, leafy echo of one's place in a system too vast to comprehend, yet too intimate to ignore. It was said that only those who could endure 3 seasons of green exile would be welcomed back. Fewer than you'd think ever returned. If one turban shape is trimmed more than the others, it means that rank is currently in ascendance. To receive a palm topiary in front of your quarters was an honor. To see it gradually reshaped into a clenched fist, less so. The message evolved, one leaf at a time. If a turban shrub is removed altogether, well, let's just say someone got reassigned to a quieter province. These topiary shapes appear mundane: cubes, cones, domes. No charges were filed, no formal notes exchanged, but the clerk's office was surrounded with hedges trimmed into closed mouths. Within a month, he requested a transfer to Syria. No one argued, but the spacing between them speaks volumes. A once generous hedge cut back to a narrow stalk that signals public embarrassment. A full shape with a hollow center. Isolation. These weren't punishments doled out by decree. They were slow, green echoes of disfavor. Court officials dreaded them more than written reprimands. A letter you could burn. A shrub lasted seasons. Because now, you've reached a place where precision could be punishment, and a single wrong snip might haunt your entire career. This is where gardening becomes evaluation. Topiary, in the Ottoman context, was not simply decoration. It was examination, a way to measure competence, intent, and sometimes obedience. You pause before a row of perfectly sculpted cypresses, their trunks hidden in spirals of clipped boxwood that form the shape of teardrops, vertical, measured, unnervingly uniform. These are known as Sesalandrima Yalara punishment paths, not because you'd be punished walking them, but because they marked the boundary between high trust and scrutiny. If a court official fell out of favor, he might be assigned to supervise this stretch. To contemplate his form, the gardeners would say slyly, "This suggests aspiration, forward movement." These bird shapes were placed near the chambers of rising stars, young viziers, favored sons, influential poets. But if the bird's beak was lowered in a future trimming, that meant favor had dimmed. These subtle shifts told a story, and only a few knew how to read it. Historians still argue whether the Grand Chamberlain was demoted in 1715 due to boxwood spirals that tilted by 3 degrees. Some say it was wind. One gardener, standing on a small ladder, clips a topiary shaped like a turban. You kneel beside a low hedge carved into the shape of a bird, perhaps a partridge. Its tail is pointed east, its beak turned upward. Further along, you reach a strange display, a topiary shaped like a fruit bowl, but intentionally asymmetrical. You pass a particularly delicate hedge trimmed into the pattern of an open palm 5 fingers, curved slightly. This was the gardener's seal of approval. There's even a zone known only by its nickname, Cesses Cessalor, the silent punishments. One gardener tells a tale, barely above a whisper, of the time a low-ranking clerk accidentally insulted a noble during a poetry recital. At the far edge of this section is a space without any topiary at all, just a wide lawn, empty but for a single pine in the center. And yet, even in the harshest corners, there's gentleness, a hedge pruned into a resting cat. You rise slowly, listening to the soft clip of distant shears. It sounds like breathing, like exhaling old tension. And you realize the topiaries weren't about perfection. You walk on, careful not to brush the bushes. They remember. You slip into a quieter lane now, one that smells faintly of oil and damp wood. The flowers have given way to tools rows of neatly hung shears, spades resting against trees, watering cans in polished copper catching moonlight like soft flames. Shears hang on racks labeled with tiny tulip icons, white for entry level, yellow for mid-tier, and red for master cutters. You run your finger along the blade of one dull worn and reverently clean. These shears once trimmed the royal iris beds. Now they rest, retired like an old scholar with soft knees and sharper memories. This is the gardener's quarter, the backstage of the performance, where meaning was measured in millimeters and tools weren't just functional, they were ritual. These were for the cypress trees, symbols of eternal life and imperial continuity. Each hook was custom-made. A mismatch could bend the message. You lift one, and the weight surprises you, balanced perfectly. You imagine using it in the early light of dawn, the world still half asleep, shaping a curve of green that might say wait or watch or worry. The first thing you notice, everything has a place. Not just a spot on a wall, but a hierarchy. A gardener passes by, bowing slightly. He carries a watering can, silver-plated, but dented with use. These weren't tools of rebellion. They were a private vocabulary. This was a euphemism for a special blend used during night pruning. Gardeners believed certain branches responded better in the absence of sunlight. This wasn't a place of instruments. It was a monastery, a place of ritual, hierarchy, and humble power. Every trowel held a story, every nick in a blade, a memory, every tool, a quiet oath. The oil-masked scent softened the blade's passage and calmed the plant's sleep cycle. Some say it calmed the gardener too. These were gesture stones. When placed near a plant, they indicated intention. These were once tied to tools during ceremonial garden walks. The bell's tone indicated the gardener's emotional state. A deep chime meant focus. A lighter one, distraction. No bell at all. Too serious, too dangerous. Bells weren't just for sound. They were A round stone meant observe only. A flat one signaled fertilize tomorrow. A pointed one, prepare to remove. These weren't just internal codes. They were part of a system of quiet communication among gardeners, avoiding words to avoid being overheard. One gardener, decades ago, was known to etch daily reflections into a cherry tree's lower branches. When he retired, the tree was cut down and its trunk carved into the handle of a ceremonial rake. The rake is still used during spring planting, full circle in every sense. On its side is a filigreed pattern of vines and a single garnet inset at the handle's top. A small ledger sits open to a page titled Rituals, and below it, in looping Ottoman script, do not dig before whispering. The pattern spelled out a sequence: circle, circle, flat, sharp, empty. Some believe it forecast his dismissal. Others think it warned of bad weather. As usual, the gardeners offered no clarification. One reads, "Only prune the branch if you remember its first bloom." Not plain cloth ones. These are ceremonial, embroidered with green thread and tiny symbols. Each symbol represented a permission level, which plants you could touch. which tools you could handle, which gardens you were allowed to enter. Gloves were not to be shared. Touching the wrong plant with unauthorized gloves was a punishable offense. There's even a cautionary tale about a novice gardener who tried to trim the cinnamon trees without clearance. He was demoted to fish pond duty for life. This wasn't gardening advice, it was ethical instruction. Gardeners weren't just caretakers, they were archivists of growth. To forget a plant story before shaping it was considered vulgar, not metaphorical, actual protocol. Before digging in certain sacred areas round memory trees, for instance, gardeners whispered short blessings into the soil, both to warn any hidden roots and to show respect. They say this practice prevented tools from breaking, or at least souls, not decoration, rank. This can belonged to a senior bostang who had earned the right to water the fig trees by the Queen Mother's pavilion. Only 3 gardeners held this position in a century. You pause beside a large oak workbench where bundles of twine, copper trowels, and waxed parchment lie waiting. There's a rack of shovels, each with a different handle, some curved, some wrapped in silk, others with inscriptions. You reach a shelf of pruning hooks, arranged by crescent shape, and then the ink knives, tiny blades used not for cutting plants, but for inscribing soft bark-hidden messages in lemon trees, short prayers in fig trunks. You come upon a low platform scattered with stone weights oval, polished, warm from sun and use. Historians still puzzle over a mysterious array of gesture stones found near the palace stables during the short reign of Sultan Osman II. A cabinet of gloves stands against the far wall. You crouch beside a shelf of oil jars, lavender, cedar, rose, and one labeled simply a Exiki moonlight. Before you leave, you notice a final rack near the exit, a collection of tiny bells, each tuned slightly differently. You pass through the tool yard with new eyes, and the gardeners, keepers of the empire's sharpest secrets. The scent shifts again as you leave the tool yard, something richer, now ripe figs, crushed coriander, roasting lamb from distant palace kitchens. You follow your nose past a low stone wall veiled in honeysuckle and into a sun-warmed courtyard, where vines twist around marble columns and fruit trees lean like gossiping aunties. You've entered the domain of whispers, not passed from mouth to ear, but from root to basket. This is the produce quarter, the living pipeline between garden and gossip. Every plant here had a function, sure, food, spice, medicine, but its real job, carrying messages. The fruit, the timing, the arrangement teach acted like a courier, slipping ideas into dinner, metaphors into mealtime, and warnings into wine. These were no ordinary figs. In palace code, figs symbolized internal matters, personal concerns, familial issues, or court rumors, best handled in-house. If a platter of figs appeared at an unexpected meal, it wasn't for nutrition. Gardeners arranged them intentionally, picking the green ones for court meetings that needed restraint, the dark ones for more festive or volatile occasions. A sudden shift in grape color near the inner court kitchens could ripple across the palace by sundown. The baskets weren't just filled with produce, they were composed. A bowl of softening apricots here, a bunch of overripe mulberries there. Not laziness messaging. This food was meant to be seen aging, not eaten. We see you. We haven't forgotten. We're just watching. A single quince atop a nest of marjoram. A compliment to someone's wit. A persimmon beside an unripe peach. Too much ambition, too soon. The cooks understood. The stewards understood. The recipients usually got the point. What was thrown out, how quickly, and with what frequency, told gardeners everything. It's sweet with a hint of smoke. Perhaps meant for you, perhaps not. But in this garden, even leftovers whisper. An untouched bunch of parsley, disinterest. A flurry of discarded rose petals, turmoil. If something disappeared entirely before it could rot, it had been claimed by someone for something under silence. A gardener nearby peels garlic in silence, the skin crackling like dry parchment. Garlic was both protection and sarcasm, depending on how it was used. Laid beneath fish, a friendly joke, hidden in a dessert, an insult wrapped in sweetness. There was one case recorded, unofficially in which a rice pudding sent to a visiting noble included a single peeled clove of garlic nestled inside. He didn't eat it, but he left Istanbul 2 days early. It meant, deal with your business privately. Don't let it spill into public sight. Peel your problems before someone else does. You pause beside a row of figs, their fat purple bodies drooping heavily on the branch. These symbolized abundance, but also division. A bowl of neatly opened pomegranate halves sent a message of transparency, but a whole sealed fruit left in a prominent place. A kind of edible diplomacy through neglect. Gardeners called it speaking with rot, elegant, passive-aggressive, and oddly fragrant. Concealment, delay, not yet. Gardeners often placed these deliberately on food carts or in courtyard niches when diplomatic visits loomed. These foods held longer-term messages. Pickling meant we're preserving this grudge. Candying meant we forgive, for now. Dried fruit was used to recall promises sweet, wrinkled, but still recognizable. You could send a dried fig and a bay leaf to someone you had done spoken to in years, and the message was clear. We remember. If a pomegranate sat untouched for days, it was a warning. Alliances were souring. There's a row of pomegranates nearby, split open, their jeweled insides gleaming like secrets. The gardeners, as usual, left no comment, just an oddly placed pear beside the ambassador's shoe. Historians still argue whether the brief cooling of Ottomans' favored relations in 1612 began with a mismatched fruit plate served to an envoy. The official records are vague. These herbs weren't just culinary, they were linguistic. Couriers carried messages sealed in herb sachets, the combination of scents revealing the tone, sage and dill, urgent but polite, mint and rosemary, agreeable but skeptical, tarragon on its own, not now. The sachets were burned after delivery, the smoke perfumed enough to avoid suspicion and coated enough to mean everything. You reach a long row of herbs, sage, mint, dill, tarragonol, labeled in elegant copper script. There's a grape arbor overhead, its clusters at various stages of ripeness. And then there are the kitchen baskets. You pass a row of covered carts, each holding wicker baskets lined in mulberry leaves. One corner features the waiting wall, where certain deliveries were placed intentionally late. There's even a term for this, gochikmix insilic, or delayed politeness. You find a bench beside a cherry tree. You pass the preserved section, now shelves of pickled lemons, dried apricots, candied quince. Near the edge of the garden is a compost, pit unassuming, but as watched as any council chamber. And so you sit under the cherry tree, nibbling a dried plum left on the bench beside you. Night has deepened, and with it comes a hush that even the wind seems reluctant to disturb. The air cools, damp with dew, and the light shifts from amber to silver. You find yourself walking into a part of the garden few people see during daylight. The lamps are dimmer here, the paths softer underfoot, carpeted in moss and fine dust. This is the domain of the night gardeners, the quiet caretakers who worked in moonlight, cloaked in mystery and scented smoke. These weren't just insomniac landscapers. The night crew operated under a different set of rules. Their tools were lighter, often wrapped in cloth to dampen sound. The sound is dull, private. He waits. But there's an incident recorded a night in 1738. But the gardener responsible vanished from the rosters the following week, leaving behind only a perfect crescent-shaped pruning scar, then slowly pours a small ladle of water into the soil. This is the Adwasi, the moon prayer, a personal act of gratitude and grounding. It's believed to calm the plants after trimming, and, maybe, the gardener himself. The night isn't silent, now it's breathing. Crickets murmur in the background. The leaves sway gently, as if nudged by invisible fingertips. Somewhere, a fountain trickles a private rhythm. He trims only the tips, placing the fallen petals into a pouch lined with lavender. And the plant, some of them, only awaken now. Night jasmine exhales its syrupy breath, heavy and narcotic. The night crew believed that sound, like light, should be rationed after sundown. Silence wasn't absence, it was a tool. The datura, dangerous and revered, opens wide like a mouth too tired to lie. The night gardeners use a special blade here, shaped like a comma, designed to slice without tearing. These flowers, rarely touched, were symbols of forgotten desires, never east. East was for beginnings, west for closure. If a pruning was done to seal a rumor, the shears would rest here until sunrise. No gardener touched them before then, not even to tidy up. A court lady once wrote secret poetry to them in milk incredible, only under moonlight. The gardeners found the scraps years later, pressed between petals. They added them to the soil. These were the plants of dreams, of stories half remembered, and the night gardeners tended them with reverence. The outer ring is for cleansing, the inner for insight. The night crew walks this path barefoot before full moons, believing the spiral absorbs what must be released. There are no records of these walks, only the impressions left in the soil. These petals will be burned at dawn as part of a quiet cleansing. They work in spirals, loops, and figures that mimic constellations. They don't start at the center of a path. They begin at the edge and work inward, as if coaxing sleep into the garden from its quiet corners. Not for the garden, but for the palace itself. A symbolic fumigation. Every cut tonight is ceremonial. They spoke little, they moved slowly, and they worked not for the court's eye, but for its memory. You spot one now, kneeling beneath a datura bush, his movements gentle and ritualistic. The moonlight touches everything differently here. Leaves shimmer where they once just glowed. Colors mute into blue and pearl. You notice how their movements don't follow the same patterns as the day crew. Some tasks were only performed under moonlight. The pruning of sleep, plants chamomile, poppy, passion flower acquired the softest touch. Moon pruning, it was called. The belief was that the plants absorbed dreams and released them through their roots at night. Trimming them in sunlight interrupted that cycle. Night gardeners respected sleep as much as structure. There is an old ritual you witness now. A gardener kneeling before a vine-covered wall, gently striking a gong no larger than his palm. Historians still debate whether the night crew held real power. Some say they were merely ornamental, more superstition than strategy. You pass a row of vines hung with small bells, silent now, but tuned to ring if moved too quickly. A security measure, but also a spiritual one. The shadows thicken near a bed of moonflowers, their ghost-white petals curled like sleeping faces. You step into a clearing shaped like a spiral, each ring planted with herbs tied to phases of the moontime: mugwort, lemongrass, sage. Near the edge of the clearing is a small, low platform where tools are placed facing west. You find a bench covered in moss, and you sit, and overhead the stars keep their steady vigil. Here, where dreams are trimmed as carefully as roses, you finally understand. The night garden isn't for beauty or power, it's for memory, for ritual, for all the things too fragile to bear the weight of daylight. The garden brightens faintly as the moon climbs higher. You move on now, away from the dew-heavy herbs, and into a walled courtyard, framed with neat hedges and creeping vines. But something's different here. The layout is more rigid, almost geometric paths shaped in concentric squares. Flower beds arranged like puzzle pieces, fountains marking corners, like punctuation. This place wasn't meant for wandering. It was meant for remembering. The carnations stand for strength, the marigolds for legacy. Their heights, very taller rows for sultans who ruled longer, shorter ones for those who were removed, let's say early. One particular patch, strikingly short and ending abruptly, is flanked by low yews mourning bushes, no name needed. This is the Garden of Memory. Not memory as in sentiment, but memory as in architecturos and hedges acting like drawers in a mind palace, each bloom recalling a name, a moment, a dynasty. These patches were planted for events that must not be forgotten, but could never be spoken aloud. A dethronement, a massacre, a betrayal. Their bloom was a silent monument. Here, the hedges are trimmed not into shapes, but into scripsinuous, flowing curls that mimic calligraphy. These were once based on royal decrees, gardeners trained for years to maintain the form. A missed curve could alter the word. A sloppy angle might erase a whole sentiment. Each step is engraved with a date and a flower. The flower marks what the empire gained that year. Sometimes it's a daffodil symbolizing wealth. Other times, a thorny rose territorial conflict. But one step bears only blank stone. That was the year of silence. The gardeners never speak of it. Here, in the Garden of Memory, history isn't just recorded. And if one patch failed to blossom, it was said the memory it guarded had faded from the empire's soul. This was the parting path. Diplomats walked this corridor before departing the palace. Each flower whispered a parting sentiment: jasmine for sweetness, cypress for dignity, honeysuckle for bonds that linger. If one type was missing, the message was loud and clear. The Ottoman palace didn't just keep history in scrolls or ink. It planted it, sculpted it, and let it bloom every spring. They formed acrostics poems or names of royal figures, revealed only when you walked in the correct sequence. Get the order wrong, and you'd read gibberish. No signage, but if you've been listening, you know this is a memory of conversation. The fig stood for knowledge, the vine for connection. The benches were never meant for comfort. They were placed to encourage reflection. Gardeners whispered that if you sat there long enough, you might remember things you never knew you forgot. Walk it right, and the name bloomed beneath your feet. You walk along the outermost ring, where carnations and marigolds line a gravel path in alternating rows. Each section here represents a reign. This is called Hatera Tassida, memory stone. Each side bears floral carvings linked to key reforms, tulips for the tulip era's aesthetic ambitions, thistles for administrative headaches, and narcissus blossoms for court introspection. The water flows clockwise. But during certain anniversaries, the flow is reversed, just to remind the court that not all memory moves forward. This section is built as a timeline. Each turn marks a major event. Right at the first bend, a small pine stands alone, surrounded by mint. That's for the conquest of Egypt. The pine for endurance. The mint for expansion, a hint of domination, since mint often overgrows. The gardeners were never subtle. Step by step, you pass reigns written not in ink, but in petals. The timeline bends here, compresses. Some branches have been clipped into zigzags, disorienting and abrupt. These weren't careless cuts. They were annotations, historical footnotes in foliage. Further inward, a hedge maze begins. It's not tall enough to get lost in, but it encourages detours. Historians still argue whether the inner hedgerow, where paths are deliberately blocked with low rose bushes, represents the Janissary mutinies. At the heart of the garden sits a square fountain shaped like a book, its water tracing slow, looping patterns across stone etchings. A nearby bed of forget-me-nots carries no label. That's deliberate. As you move along the path, you spot flower beds bordered in mosaic tiles, each tile bearing a single Arabic letter. These weren't random. You reach a section known as the Garden of Lines. In one quiet alcove, you see a strange cluster of plants, a vine, a fig tree, and 2 stone seats. Further on, you discover the legacy steps, a short flight of carved stone stairs, flanked by narrow planters. Before you leave, you pass a lattice tunnel woven with honeysuckle, jasmine, and cypress. You step through slowly, feeling each scent unfurl like a page from a book. It's grown. The garden changes, again, not in color or scent, but in mood. It's subtler, this shift, a tension beneath the lavender, a watchfulness in the way the breeze moves the reeds. You're no longer in a space for memory or ritual. You're in the part of the garden where things once boiled over. Gardeners leave these fragments intentionally, reminders of the time the garden itself pushed back. It began, as most things do, in a palace, with beauty. Too much of it. The tulip, early 18th century, saw a surge in floriculture, art, and architectural indulgence. Courtiers competed to breed the rarest, most ornamental tulip. Poets wrote odes to petals. Diplomats were sent bouquets instead of treaties. One sultan reportedly commissioned a flower bed in the exact shape of his own nose. They overwatered the most prized beds. They trimmed the tulip stems too short. At one time, this was a space for quiet diplomacy. Dignitaries would gather beneath the pines, sipping rose sherbet, nodding politely. But during the revolt, someone filled this pool with red dye and floated dead tulip heads on the surface. When the sun rose, the court saw a pond of blood. They let weeds creep into the designs of noble coats of arms. To the untrained eye, it looked like decline. To those in the know, it was a floral manifesto. You notice the petals are trimmed slightly, almost imperceptibly, to make the flowers resemble mourning caps. One lands in your palma tulip petal, still faintly pink, slightly curled. You hold it gently. It's not just a petal, it's a page. One line in a chapter the empire tried to forget. A courtier once requested these arrangements after losing favor with the sultan. The gardeners obliged, then kept the pattern going long after his exile. No one asked why. Everyone understood. This is the site of the floral revolt. His shears snip carefully, rhythmically, but you notice something odd. He's trimming not by shape, but by sound. Click, pause, click, click, pause, a code. You follow it to a pergola where no flowers bloom, just vines, twisting, bare, stubborn. This pergola was once the showpiece of the tulip pavilion, the center of floral excess. After the revolt, it was stripped bare, no replanting, no regrowth. Gardeners call it kalb bozlek, the hollow heart, a reminder that even beauty must know its bounds. You listen and slowly realize it mimics an old military cadence from a time when palace guards marched through these gardens during the early days of the revolt. To the untrained eye, it's just another garden terrace. But to those who know, this was ground zero for one of the strangest episodes in Ottoman history, a moment when flowers became political, petals became protests, and the delicate empire of tulips nearly collapsed under its own weight. It was stolen, not once, but twice. Each time, a new tulip replaced it, less perfect, more ordinary. The message was clear. The people weren't impressed. And when the concubine's namesake, tulip, was replanted a third time, someone pruned it into the shape of a skull, a silent rebellion tucked into floral form. You tread carefully along the path, now scattered with fallen rose hips and broken marigold stems. Not carelessness, symbolism, and the people. They watched tulips bloom while bread vanished. That's where the trouble started. You stop before a stone pedestal once topped with a prized hybrid tulip, ivory petals, violet edges, named after a royal concubine. But the symbolism was real. Gardeners reported rows of tulips slashed overnight, rose beds rearranged to form crude phrases in court slang. Even the ceremonial fountains were tampered with, one redirected to spill over a carved imperial tugra, eroding it day by day. Historians still argue whether the revolt of 1730, led by a man named Patrona Halal, was directly sparked by a single tulip. Likely not. Here, in this terrace, the gardeners responded the only way they could, with subtle sabotage. You step closer to a ring of old pines, arranged in a circle around a shallow, reflecting pool. The reflection is murky tonight, the moon fragmented. It was never acknowledged, but the gardeners remembered, and so do the trees. Further down, a patch of chrysanthemums seems too neat. You pass a lone gardener now, tending to a patch of carnations. It's not defiance, it's remembrance, and maybe warning. At the edge of the terrace, a mosaic path leads downward, each tile shaped like a fallen petal. A soft wind blows, and a shower of leaves tumbles across your path. But the gardeners didn't forget. They never forget. And tonight, you walk the terrace as they once did, not with fear, but with understanding, that even the gentlest things, if pressed too hard, will push back. You descend the final stair into the oldest part of the garden, a grove few ever reach, tucked behind a veil of cypress and silence. The air here is heavier, not with moisture or scent, but with presence. The trees are older, the paths more weathered. You step carefully, not from fear, but reverence. This is where the garden ends, and where its longest breath is held. The last garden. Here, there are no brilliant flower beds or clever pathways, no fountains, No clipped topiaries, just moss, stone, and the hush of things that remember. The plants are not arranged, they simply are, grown old without interference, their roots twisted together under the soil like sleeping hands. A solitary figure moves through the grove, ahead of you a man, bent but unbroken, his robes the color of tree bark, his movements slow as time. He sits, exhales, and closes his eyes, as if acknowledging your presence. You're not here to learn anymore. You're here to listen, not to words, but to the garden itself. The roots creak, the moss hums. A distant olive branch sheds a leaf-like punctuation. This garden is not teaching, it is concluding, not asleep, remembering. The broom rests across his lap like a scepter of patience. You sit beside him, not speaking. But over the years, as the empire faded, so did the need for reflection. One by one, the gardeners retired and simply stayed. Now only this man remains, a steward not of plants, but of legacy. He carries no tools, only a broom of reeds, its bristles soft from years of use. He is the last imperial gardener. He walks slowly to the center of the grove, where a single tulip grows from a crack in the stone. Not royal, not rare, just a tulip. You've walked far tonight across centuries of silence, through corridors lined in lavender, past petals that whispered and fountains that once spoke riddles only moonlight could answer. He kneels, breathes on it softly, and turns back toward the shadows. He does not see you, or perhaps pretends not to. Only the scent remains, soft as velvet, dried mint, wet earth, jasmine fading like memory at dawn. You watch them without thinking, your thoughts already halfway into dreams, but your mind is already drifting, far past the walls of the palace, beyond the rustling fig trees, even beyond the oldest bench beneath the olive. You are still, and the garden around you settles too. Not silent, exactly, just quiet, in a way that invites sleep, not stillness. You pass markers, simple stones with no names. These weren't graves, they were pauses, moments of silence made permanent. One for a gardener who died mid-pruning, another for a sultan who visited once, unannounced, and left with tears in his eyes. These markers are unmarked, but never forgotten. He sweeps the path not to clean it, but to feel it. Each stroke a memory, each leaf brushed aside, a name recalled. His rhythm is not hurried. It is the pace of memory settling into soil. The sounds of the garden fountain's footsteps, the occasional sweep of reed on stone have faded like the final chords of a lullaby. You're still here, but your breathing has slowed. The tulips have curled inward, the fig trees hum in their sleep, and the last gardener has laid down his broom. Your eyes, heavy now, trace the vague silhouettes of leaves against the darkening sky. This place was once the retirement garden where senior gardeners were allowed to walk and reflect. He pauses beside a fig tree, its trunk split from age, sap seeping like honey. He touches it gently, and you realize this was the first tree planted in the garden. You don't need to remember every meaning, every shadow, every breeze that turned a leaf toward warning or love. The garden remembers for you, not symbolically, the actual first. Brought as a sapling from Bursa, carried in a pot wrapped in velvet. It watched the rise of the tulips, the fall of viziers, the whispered poems, and the quiet sabotages. It still bears fruit, though few eat it now. You walk further, and the garden narrows. The plants grow denser, the light dimmer. The last gardener stops near a bench, It's not ornate, just stone, smooth from decades of rain. Around you, the plants sway slightly, even without wind, and you are here for its final lines. The last gardener opens his eyes and stands. You watch him go. Then you look at the tulip, and you understand. Some things bloom once, others again and again. But the rarest thing of all is the bloom that remembers. Wind down, the air grows still, heavier in its quiet now. Let the details soften. Let the names and the codes, the symbols in fruit and flower, all blur gently in your memory. Here in the stillness, everything feels quieter, deeper. The paths you followed begin to disappear behind you, not lost, just dimmed, folded gently away like pressed herbs between pages. With each breath, you're further away from the palace walls, further from intrigue, further from politics disguised in petals. Now, even the stars seem fewer. Just one or two, blinking slowly, sleepily, high above the cypress line. Your body sinks. Your breath is slower now. Your fingers twitch slightly, maybe recalling the touch of bark, of petal, of cool water over stone. Sleep is near. Just one more breath, one more slow sigh, and then only the garden remains.